In this lesson, I want to talk about how we then manage these insect pests if they do arrive. And I think we can all agree that the best case scenario would be if we didn't have any insect pests. So starting out, the best way to manage these insects is to actually just change the environment to promote lots of these beneficial insects or good insects. They're going to feed on all of the problematic insects. And one of the ways we do this is by changing the environment to encourage those good bugs, the good beneficials, to live in our backyard. Many beneficial insects would love to live in your backyard if there was the food that they like to eat, or maybe the specific plants that they like to, complete their life cycle on. We talked about, the different types of metamorphosis and the different life cycles that insects have. Well, beneficial insects, many of them have a phase in their life where they do feed on, say, aphids or other problem insects that we don't want in our garden. But another part of their life, they like to feed on nectar and pollen. So this is a lot of times when you see people talk about beneficial plant gardens or planting out flowers for beneficial insects, what you're doing is, say, the adult phase of a beneficial insect would love to just feed on some pollen or a little bit of nectar that's stored in a plant. And so if we have all these flowers to promote that adult phase, well, they're going to lay more eggs, and the larvae are then going to feed on our problem insects and help manage our pests. When we're thinking about feeding beneficial insects or giving them an environment that they want, it's also really good to think about that they're going to need to eat all year round. So when you choose the flowers that you're going to plant, or the different types of plants that you're going to plant for your beneficials, you need to make sure that there's kind of a good mix in there that kind of flowers all year round. This is a problem when I was growing in California because it gets so hot and dry in the summer. Trying to find plants that are blooming in the middle of summer is difficult. So finding native plants can be really helpful because native plants are so suited for that environment that oftentimes they will be blooming at times when your other plants wouldn't be blooming. So look at what native species you have in the area, and this will do a better job of attracting native pollinators and beneficials that have kind of grown up and around these native plants. Thank you so much for watching this video series all about pest management and disease management. I really hope that you're enjoying it. I just wanted to let you know that this series is actually just a really small section of a much broader course all about gardening. Everything from, how to select seeds and planting seeds all the way up to harvest and kind of just everything in between. And so if this sounds like something you're interested in and really broadening your understanding in gardening, I'm going to place a link below in the description, and this will bring you to the Wild Abundance Gardening School in North Carolina. And we have a sliding scale payment system for the whole course, so you can pay what you can afford in order to have access to this wealth of knowledge. Another great way to bring beneficials in, if you have the space in your garden, is to plant flowers around and in with the plants that you're growing for your produce. So by planting, one of my favorites is alyssum. Alyssum is this plant that produces all these white flowers, and it's called sweet alyssum because when you smell it, it really is sweet. And I used to tell the people that I worked with that you're basically putting out free food for all of these bugs to come in, and they love free food, right? Everybody loves a free lunch. And so they come in and they hang out and they kind of help control our insect pests. Another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about beneficial insects and creating an environment that they want to stay in is when we do spray our plants or our garden areas, to not use products that are going to harm the beneficials. Even a lot of organic products do really hurt beneficial insects just as much as they do the pest. So if you are going to spray, try and minimize that damage by maybe, spraying in a different spot. So only spraying, if you can, one part of the plant, or spraying at night if you're worried about flying insects or something like that. And in these ways, we can reduce the bykill of these beneficial insects that we're trying to promote. So like I said, ideally we would want the beneficials to just kind of take care of all of the insect problems for us, but in a real world, they don't always do. So what can we do to help the beneficials out and to help keep pests out of our garden? Now I want you to think of in your house when you get house flies or just flies flying around your house. What do you do in order to prevent those flies from getting in your house? Well, you close your doors, you maybe put screens, a screened in porch is nice. You don't leave food out. You do all these things that keep flies out of your house, but at the same time, you're not seeing the flies and just trying to kill them all. You're not spraying to try to just nuke all the flies every time you see a fly. It's really more of an approach, right? You just close the door when you come in. You don't leave your doors wide open, and that helps control flies. So the same thing, try and think of that when you were also working in the garden. What can you do similar to how you control houseflies that is going to keep those insects from feeding on your garden? So this idea is called physical pest control. So you're doing things just kind of in the physical area that are going to exclude pests from feeding on your food. So this idea of physical pest protection is all these things that we can do that aren't spraying, insecticides, and they're not, planting plants around your garden to bring in beneficials, but can still have a really big effect on controlling our pest insects. The first example of this physical pest protection is just like a screened-in porch or the screens on your windows, is to put row cover on your plants. And this is just a fine weave fiber that, like a mesh that goes over the top of your rows, and it literally is keeping the insects from getting to your plants. So you're physically excluding them from feeding on your plants. And this can work great. It's important to think about maybe how that row cover could affect the growth of your plants. So for instance, if you use a row cover that's too heavy, well then maybe you're keeping some of the sunlight from getting down to your plants. So to keep this in mind. Another great way to keep insects from getting to your plants is to use sticky traps or a sticky substance to actually physically, just stick to the insects. So oftentimes when you purchase sticky traps, they're a card of some sort, like a card stock that's covered in a glue or a sticky substance, and you can hang them usually around your garden or next to plants that you normally have problems with. And how they work is they're usually of a bright color, usually yellow or blue, and this kind of attracts certain types of insects that hone in on that color, thinking that maybe it's a flower, and the insects just stick to the glue surface. If you are going to be using sticky traps, it's also nice because then you can monitor what's kind of moving in and out of your garden. If you check the sticky trap, you can look at the different type of insects that are stuck to it, and maybe you can kind of, glean more information about, what's going on in your garden. If your garden is situated, say, next to a field, this can be also really helpful because oftentimes, maybe as the field gets dry or, completes its life cycle or something like that, the insects might move into your garden. So by putting sticky traps, along that field, you can better control those insects moving into your garden and causing a problem later. In the same theme as these sticky trap cards, you can also purchase a sticky glue that you can paint onto different plants. Now this is more towards if you have trees and things of that nature. You probably wouldn't do it on your vegetable crops, but a lot of insects will have one life cycle where they're down in the soil, and then as they hatch, they'll migrate up the tree. For instance, pecan weevils, they're down in the soil when they're young, and then they go up the tree if they're going to then feed on the nuts. So this is when, if you had a sticky, picture like a half-inch amount of glue around the base of the tree, this will stop those insects from physically going up the tree. So it's a great way to control different insects, and you don't have to spray any pesticides or anything like that. Another great way to control insects that maybe we don't often think about is to literally just pick them off with your hands. If you have a small garden or a few plants, picking off a few of the insects or the egg masses or the adults can make a huge difference in controlling that insect population. Kind of like I was talking about how, each insect can produce a ton of different eggs, and really expand the life cycle. Well, if you go through, once every couple days and pick off all of those egg masses, well, you're doing a great job in just keeping those numbers low, and it didn't probably take you that much time. One example where picking off the egg masses can really help is armyworms. So armyworms can be really devastating. They can just eat every single thing in your garden, and they usually are pretty cyclical. So they show up and they just destroy everything and move on. They're kind of like a plague. And so armyworms, they're a moth. So the moth flies in, lays eggs on your leaves, and then the moth kind of sheds some of its scales and creates this little protective covering. So if you're walking your garden and you see this little fuzzy egg mass and you pick that off, well, you just prevented, say, maybe thousands of those little tiny armyworms that are going to quickly grow into massive armyworms and just defoliate everything. So again, spending time in your garden, observing these things, asking questions. If you see a little fuzzy mass, or don't just blow it off and say, it's whatever. Say, is this eggs? What could this possibly be? Maybe peel off the fuzzy mass and look. You could cut it off, put it in a plastic bag and watch and just see what happens. Because, sometimes, eggs all look pretty similar, and then you put them in a plastic bag and you realize, oh, wow, those were stink bugs, or those were beneficial. And you can learn a lot from just observing what you see while you're out there. Just like hand picking off, insects and killing them, sometimes you can spray water and it kind of has the same effect. You're knocking them off of where they want to be. So if you go out there and you just kind of douse down the insects with water and flush them down, and you do it, every few days, you can actually have a pretty big impact on that specific pest. Now, the important part of this is that you are doing it with some regularity, because if you just knock them off once, well, it's kind of like a rainstorm. They're kind of used to that. But if every single day you just keep spraying them with water, well, that's a lot of energy that they have to expend to get back up where they were feeding, and you can have really good control over those insects, and all you were really doing was just spraying them with some water. You may have heard of the term diatomaceous earth before, but maybe not actually realized what it was. So diatomaceous earth is made up of diatoms, which are actually just an ancient algae, and this algae kind of produces a shell around itself that's made out of silica. So think of glass. It's like an algae covered in glass. And all these algae, they reproduced millions of years ago and died in certain areas. And now we've gone in and we can dig up these diatoms, and this is what diatomaceous earth is. Now, if you think of it as all these little tiny micro glass shards, well, if you put this diatomaceous earth around your plants or on your plants, these insects that have, these joints and, little like mandibles, little gaps in their shells and stuff, if that glass kind of gets in all those little pockets, it's really annoying and they really don't like it. And so that's a great way to keep insects from getting into your garden. It's also great, for instance, like around your home, if you have problems with cockroaches. By putting diatomaceous earth out, the cockroaches really hate all those the sharp little bits and won't, go into your house. So again, you're not really spraying trying to kill them. You're just excluding them using this material that they just don't want to be around. Another great product for keeping pests off of your plants is kaolin clay. So kaolin clay is just a really, really white clay. That's all it is. And what you can do is by spraying it on your plants, it's kind of like putting camouflage on the leaves. And the reason why is many insects, as they're flying over your garden, they hone in on the different wavelengths of light coming off the green leaves. And so if a certain insect really likes a specific plant, it can key in on that green wavelength coming off your plant. So if you spray your plant with white and now your plant is kind of white, well, the insect can't even see it. It doesn't even know that the plant is there. This works great for cucumber beetles, which can be devastating on all kinds of cucurbits, squash, and all kinds of stuff. And so as those cucumber beetles fly over your garden looking for their favorite plant, they might just keep on flying because they won't even know that your plant is there, covered in that kaolin clay. It's important to keep in mind, if you're going to use kaolin clay, that say you plant a squash plant and you get the plant comes out of the ground, you have your 2 leaves, which are called your cotyledon leaves. Well, in a few days, you probably have a brand new, fresh leaf, a full-size first leaf. So say you sprayed kaolin clay when it was just those 2 leaves. Well, by the time that true leaf comes out, well, it's not protected. So you have to reapply that clay every time you have more leaves to cover up and hide those new leaves. And this can be a problem if you live in a really rainy area, because the clay will just keep washing off, every time you spray it. Well, it rains, then you lose it. So, it may not work for everybody, but it's a great tool to have if the opportunity presents itself that you can just camouflage and hide your plants from the insects. Another type of pest protection that you can do in your garden, and it's a little advanced and sometimes can be overwhelming, but you plant a crop that is their favorite, the insect pest's favorite crop, and it's called a trap crop. And what it is it lures in all of these insects that would normally be feeding on the crop that you don't want them to. And then once they're in the trap crop, you can maybe mow it or kill them with a stronger pesticide, and so that then they don't get into your garden, but you still can manage and control those pests. And like I said, it can be a little advanced and a little confusing because you're trying to make sure it's growing at the right rate. You also don't want the trap crop to bring in more pests than normally would show up, because now you just planted their favorite plant ever, and maybe you're going to bring them in from the neighborhood. They're going to come in from the town down the road. So I generally don't practice as much trap cropping, but again, just know that it is a tool, because you might find in your area that if you have a trap crop of something just a little away from your garden, you might completely lure all of your pests problems for a specific crop over there and not have any problems. Another method that kind of is on the borderline of physical pest protection and then also more of kind of a spraying pest protection is using pheromone sprays or pheromone traps. So insects have pheromones that they use to locate their mates if they want to reproduce. Certain flying insects do. And so we have been able to find out what these pheromones are, kind of like a love potion, and we can synthesize them. And then by spraying them in the environment, we can, just put a massive amount of pheromone in the area, and the insects have no idea where to fly to mate. And so you can lower the amount of pest populations that come after, they reproduce and make eggs. Or another way we can do it is we can put out sticky traps, but put a pheromone lure on there. So what it is it's a bait that's attracting insects of just a single type. This can be really helpful, especially for certain species. We've got really good pheromone lures and traps. So if you are struggling with a specific pest problem, maybe look and see if there is a pheromone lure and trap for that pest. One that comes to mind really readily is codling moths. So codling moths can be really bad in apples. And if by using pheromone traps and pheromone, little misters to put the pheromone out into your orchard, you can have great control over codling moths, and you didn't really spray a pesticide per se, you were just using a pheromone. One additional method for controlling pests, which I'm not sure exactly which category I'd put this in, but is actually releasing beneficial insects into your garden to help control pests. Now, these type of releases can work, but they are a little tricky, because you imagine if you take an insect that's raised at a insectary in upstate New York or something like that, and you just it ships to you and you just release it out in your garden. Well, those insects, they might have a hard time navigating your area, or they might just fly away. I think of this oftentimes when people purchase lady beetles or ladybugs. They buy them for their hardware store and they just release them in their garden. Well, the next day, usually you can't find a single one, because lady beetles love to fly around. They love to search out, different things to eat. So I usually don't recommend the release of insects into your garden. However, there are a few insects that can be very helpful in controlling pests. One example of when I would recommend this type of release is, for instance, if you purchase green lacewings. Now, lacewings are an interesting insect because their adult form doesn't necessarily feed on your pests, but the juvenile form is a voracious eater. And this juvenile form, it will eat tons of insects, but it'll also just kill insects just almost for fun. So these you can release in your garden, and they can do a really good job of kind of cleaning up an event, or like say an outbreak, for instance, and you can get it better under control. Another time when these releases can be really helpful is if you're growing in a hoop house or a greenhouse, because you're going to release these insects and they can't go anywhere. They're not going to leave. So even if you don't have a ton of, pests in that greenhouse, well, they're going to stick around. They're going to be way more likely to hunt for that, say, one aphid on the leaf and kill it, because they can't go anywhere to try and find, a leaf that has 1,000 aphids for them to just kind of like sit back and just, munch aphids. Now, all these methods are great tools to just keep in mind and to kind of remember, in the future when you're trying to control pests. Maybe you'll think back to this video and be like, oh yeah, I remember he said that maybe spraying with water would help. So try that out, see if that works. Try out all these little tools to try and control your pests before ultimately going to a pesticide. Now, we're going to talk about pesticides in a video. We're going to do a whole video all about pesticides, but I just wanted to introduce this segment first because I think we can get so much better control over our insect pests if we're thinking about, planting habitat for our beneficials or trying out these physical pest protection methods rather than just turning to a pesticide that we think will work really well.